Hi folks! Today we're talking about mass communication, and this is covered in Wood's chapter 14. And we talk about this because we are inundated by mass communication, and especially being an online course or accessing any of these materials online, you are very connected to MassComm. So not necessarily just the computer, but radio, television, all of the YouTube videos, right? All of these things. So we'll talk a bit more about that and try and give you a sense of what to pay attention to and how to be a critical consumer of that mass communication because it has a very large effect on our lives. So the focus questions that Wood selected for this chapter is how do media shape our thinking? To what extent is news constructed or created? What is the mean world syndrome? How can you develop media literacy? So how do media shape our thinking? I just want to take a moment and point out that media is plural. It is not singular, and that's why it says how do media, because media is a plural word. Okay, so what is MassComm? Right, I've mentioned we're inundated by it. So, according to Wood, mass communication consists of all media that address large audiences or publics: books, films, television, radio, newspapers, advertising, magazines, and other forms of visual, audio, and print communication that reach masses of people, right? Hence the mass communication. And this comes from Wood, 2014, and this is on page 288. So please take note of the form for the in-text citation. It's very simple. This is the APA version. And so because it's a direct quotation, you have to have the page number. If this was paraphrasing and you had information that you had learned from reading Wood, but you didn't need to directly quote it, then you can include just Wood's name and the year in the parentheses. All right. So with mass communication, it's important to become a critical consumer. So how do we do that? It's important to ask critical questions. So why is the story getting so much attention? Whose interests are being served by the story? Are the sources credible? Are they reliable? Are they sufficient? Are the sides balanced? And are there gatekeepers who are keeping certain perspectives from us? What's the motivation of those gatekeepers? Why are we only hearing part of the story? Right? Who are the people who are in power letting us know those parts of the story? So these are questions we're going to come back to, but these are the underlying ones to really be asking yourselves anytime you're engaging with mass communication and to become critical consumers and critical thinkers about these messages that we see all the time. So we're going to cover 4 key media theories. One is the uses and gratification theory, then the cultivation theory, agenda setting theory, and framing. Uses and gratifications theory. So what do people use media for? People select media, according to this theory, in order to meet their personal needs. In other words, we choose media because it gives us something that we value or that we want. And so a question to ask from this theory is what kinds of values and wants do the various mass media fill? Okay. So this theory, the way we're going to look at it, very direct. It just says the uses and gratification theory, right, looks at people choose media because they have a use for it. They use particular media because they're gratified by it, because it's what they want. So what kinds of values and wants? So for example, my own choices, right? I choose Walking Dead and Downton Abbey are 2 among a few others, but those are kind of go-to shows. And I choose them because they're entertaining, right? I think enough at work and I don't want to think when I'm not. So I don't watch many documentaries, interestingly enough. I choose shallow plot lines, big explosions, apparently lots of gory zombies, because it helps me escape from the thinking of work. But then news-wise, I choose NPR, and I often choose the Al Jazeera network. And I choose NPR often for more local stories, while the Al Jazeera network gives me more perspectives on international news than I get from, say, MSNBC or CNN or Fox News or any of the US-based. BBC also gives a different and more international perspective on news. And so you hear stories in different ways and from different places. So that's why I make the choices that I do, because some of the values that I want, at least within my news sources, are to have broader range, right? To have stories come from more places. Okay, so we're going to move on to cultivation theory. This one is far more complex. Uses and gratification is the easiest that we'll see. So cultivation theory, this is from George Gerbner. Got a picture of him here. And the question about cultivation theory is, what reality does media portray? Right? That was this question underlying it. And so cultivation theory assumes that the cumulative effect of media cultivates an inaccurate worldview. So you've probably heard the word cultivation before. It often comes into play, for instance, in farming. You cultivate plants, you grow them. And so the idea here is that this is a very long-term effect. This is not immediate. It takes a lot. And it's the cumulative effect of persistent long-term exposure to television content. And it also says that this is not a huge, big, right? Oh, we've noticed this marked difference. It says persistent long-term exposure to TV content has small but significant measurable average effects on how heavy viewers perceive the world. So this study was done around 1980, was based in television. We didn't have readily accessible internet at the time. And the way they divided viewers is with light viewers were less than 2 hours a day of watching television. Moderate viewers watched 2 to 4 average hours a day on television, and heavy viewers watched over 4 hours a day. So for these heavy viewers, that's really the only group they notice these significantly measurable effects. And when I use the term significant, that's a research term that just says, okay, based on the numbers that we've crunched, this number, even if it's a small one, is remarkably different, right? Is significantly different, and we notice an actual change going on here, as opposed to like, we could write that off just because it's so small, right? So cultivation effect, heavy viewers, long-term viewers, the way they perceive the world changes. So when we look at how many hours a day folks are watching and what the study is based on, and then we compare from 1980, around 1980, to today. So today's viewing trends. The average daily media use, this is from 2015, from the source Statistica. And so it's done in minutes, and you can see that television watching is this blue, and we're at 279 minutes. So if you want to divide that by 60, basically the average viewing trends in the US are now heavy viewers, right? So we no longer have as many light, medium, because medium would be the average, right? So our average has shifted to that over 4 hours a day, which says a lot about why cultivation theory still matters to look at, even though it came out in 1980. So this also gives you a sense of some of the other, right, so here we have online, and online means like PC, laptop, and then radio, huge increase in tablet, which is, right, that's why they've separated it out from online, and then they've also separated smartphone, and it says non-voice as in like not the actual phone function. That's also separated out from online because the tablets and the smartphones are so significantly different. And we've got a drop in magazines, and newspapers have been pretty low for a while and slowly dropping even more. So within cultivation theory, we have two major concepts, and the first of these is mainstreaming effects. And the idea behind mainstreaming effects says that mass messages stabilize and homogenize what would normally be very different perspectives. So what does that mean? It means that groups or people who have very different backgrounds, who come from different places, would normally have very different perspectives about topics. And instead, when they are heavy viewers over time, they're these very, very different people kind of come together in this more middle of the road perspective because they've been exposed to basically the same messages, right? So when we say it stabilizes and homogenizes, it means that it stabilizes as in kind of we start to even out the graph, and I'll show you that in a moment. And homogenizes means we kind of make things the same. So the example all the way from 1980 is related to crime, income, and race. And we can see the breakdown between light and heavy viewers. So they interviewed folks and they said that fear of crime is a very serious personal problem, right, for these individuals. And it was basically, we'll go with a yes/no answer. And we divided it by income. And so high income, light viewers, heavy viewers, light viewers, heavy viewers, low income, light viewers, heavy viewers, right? So people in different income brackets often live in very different parts of the city, the state, the country, and crime rates are statistically higher in low income areas. And you can see that those light viewers, those people who are still who are not nearly as affected by the mass media messages in the low income neighborhoods, 35% say yes, like fear of crime is a very serious personal problem for me. The light viewers in medium income areas, about 16% said, yeah, this is something I'm worried about. And high income areas, 10% said, I fear this. So that's a pretty significant difference. But then we look at the heavy viewers, and they're all watching those same crime and detective stories. And so now all of a sudden we've got what we call this homogenizing. So you can see that we've gone to 26, 25, and 33 instead of 10, 16, and 35, right? So the heavy viewers, their numbers get much, much closer together. They also divided it by race, and they just divided it by white and non-white. And so again, this fear question, fear of crime. So light viewers, white light viewers said 17% yes, scared of crime, serious problem. Non-white light viewers, 46% identified as saying yes, crime is a serious concern in my life, or the fear of crime. Heavy viewers, we don't see nearly the same homogenizing effect as we did across income, but we have a pretty significant coming together, right? So we've gone from 17 to 27 and dropped from 46 to 40. So now instead of the gap between 17 and 46, we only have the gap between 27 and 40. So the heavy viewers are much closer in their perception of the world and how much crime is a problem. Interestingly enough, when they were doing the study, one of the pieces I've heard about it is that they asked folks, what percent of the population do you think are police or law enforcement? And they pretty consistently got answers like 20%, right? 20% are police or judges or lawyers. And the reason being is that there's so many crime shows on television. So it had actually changed the perception of what jobs folks have. So mainstreaming effect, things go to the middle of the road perspective for heavy viewers. And then we also have what we call the mean world syndrome. So the mean world syndrome says we actually increase, as we also saw in the last graph, we increase our fear that crime is a serious problem, that the world is a violent and mean place. Right? So we call this the mean world syndrome because people basically believe that the world is scarier and meaner and more violent than it is. And it drastically affects people's behavior. So the largest effect, the one that underpins most others, is the perception that crime is a growing problem. While in fact, statistically, crime has actually dropped over time, the perception of crime has risen. So I've given you this graph, and I've given you a lot more resources within the additional resources list under this lecture, specifically about the mean world syndrome, and there's a clip about it because it's fascinating, and people continue to study it because it really is something that's causing social strife and is being perpetuated by mass media. So, in comparison to cultivation theory, we're going to switch and talk about agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory was developed in 1972 by two gentlemen called McCombs and Shaw. And the central claim of the agenda setting theory is that media shapes the public's agenda. So in other words, the power of the press sets the agenda of public discussion. The press, what stories we see, determines then what people will think and talk about, which I know sounds obvious, but we're going to break it down some more. So, the news is supposed to be objective. It's not, we'll just tell you now. And the way that you can look at that is just compare how stories are talked about on different news sources. I mentioned that I watch particular news channels, and it's because you get such different stories, even about the same event. So the way news crafts their stories and what stories they choose to cover are often determined by political interest, by who founded, right, their channel. So even though we want to believe that the news is objective and unbiased third party, it's not. So it's just something to be aware of. But we still like to say that it is. We like to say that the news is objective. And so people in the public, they look to professionals, they look to journalists as experts for where should we spend our time? What should we care about? Where should we be looking? Right? So instead of the news writing stories about this is what people care about, it also works this other way of people looking in the newspaper and saying, oh, there are stories about these things, that means I should care about these things. So in other words, topics that dominate the news, people then rank as the most important to them. Right? So, for example, there's a study done, and based on the number of articles about a topic that show up in the New York Times or similar news magazines, actually predicts how that topic's importance in the public's eyes is going to go up in polls. And there's a very direct correlation. So it's, although 0.3% to 0.9% sounds small, when we're talking public poll numbers, that is a very significant jump when we're counting it, right? For every 10 articles about this topic, here's the percent increase we're going to see that the public says they care about it. So we need to take a look at who sets the agenda for the agenda setters, right? So news editors are big guardians, right? If you have done a school newspaper, you know that you decide what stories are going, what do we want to cover, where am I going to put the stories, how many inches am I going to give you to write about it? So they are called gatekeepers, right? They are the ones who let you in the gate or keep you locked out. Political candidates help set the agenda. Public relations professionals, their job is to get things in the news in the way they want it done. And interest groups, right? So lobbying groups and interest groups. And something that's important to note is what we call above the fold placement. And the name comes from paper newspapers, right? So anything above the fold, these top stories, are seen as the most important by the public. And so if you put something on that front page, the public is going to think, oh, this must be more important than what's on the third page. But the person making that decision is actually the gatekeeper, right? And that's the important part here. So even though a lot of our news has shifted online, we still see this above the fold placement by when you pull up a news site and what headlines come up first, what's on the scroll, right? What do you have to go all the way down at the bottom of the page to look for, right? So that above the fold placement kind of marks for readers, oh, this is what I'm supposed to care about. So with our change in technology, it's worth considering, will our new media shape the agenda, the opinions, and the behavior of people? So when we look at how people use different media, folks have found that for the population of the generations who are over approximately 55 years of age, they rely primarily on newspapers to get their news, whereas 35 to 54 rely primarily on television, and 18 to 34 years old rely primarily on the internet, right, to get their news But they've also found that if you are a newspaper reader, you have higher knowledge of issues. You know more about the details. You're more aware of the kind of the whole issue instead of just skimming through it. So, because with television and internet, we tend to have more content choice, but we also have lower attention, and so we really just jump around a lot. So we might know a tiny bit about a ton of stuff, but it's those newspaper readers who really kind of get more of that information. So if we take a look, the weekly time spent with media in the United States, and this was in fall of 2003 by medium type, and time in hours. So we've got time in hours, and they've broken it down by generation. So millennials, which is you all, Generation X, boomers, and what they're calling the silents. It's called the silent generation because they were the stoic ones through the wars. They didn't talk much. So digital, the millennials use more digital, and they're the only generation thus far who uses more digital forms for their media. And they're pretty close to even, and then we see the digital drop drastically off with the generations, and we see the traditional forms such as newspaper and radio being much higher. So it's important to think about what media we're using and how that affects the message that we get, and then how that message then affects how we think. So from agenda setting, they developed another theory called framing. So another researcher came along and said, okay, agenda setting, I get this. This makes sense. But it's not enough. And so this new theory of framing says that we need to look at how the media sets agendas. How does it create stories in such a way that say this is what's important to look at? So framing was created by Robert Entman in 1993. This is a picture of the guy. And the definition here, to frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation for the item mentioned. So to translate this, when you call something salient, it means it's highlighted, it's important, it's worth paying attention to. And so Entman says that to frame is when you take some aspects of what's going on or what people think is going on, and you highlight those ones within a story in a way that says this is what caused the problem, or this is what the problem is, or this is good and bad, or this is how we fix it. Right? And so that very much influences then people's opinion of the issue. So framing alters our perception of the salience of information in a couple different ways. Through selection, emphasis, exclusion, and elaboration. Selection says this is what we're choosing to include. Emphasis says, here's what we're going to focus on. Here's what's going on the above the fold placement. Here's what we're going to spend more time talking about, more inches talking about. Exclusion, what are we choosing not to have a story about? What are we choosing not to say in a story? Who are we choosing to not interview, right? So it's the opposite of selection. And elaboration is what are we going to spend the most time and the most detail on? So I have an ad here for you, or sorry, a commercial, cartoon for you about how different types of news sources will frame the same issue. So in the Conservative Daily, we see the war is working, terrorist honcho is caught, whereas in Liberal Times, it says inspections are working, right? We see U.S. forest policy aids timber industry in the Liberal Times, whereas here, timber industry aids U.S. forests. And so we have that flipping based on the values, right, of liberal groups versus conservative groups. So we see a lot of framing in politics and in news. The news texts really reflect power plays. Who's got the money? Who's going to get their story out there? And so politicians actually use news against one another and about key issues they support. So if they know that a politician is going to make a speech about this big event, the people who disagree with that politician will have a speech ready even before the other one's given, and then they just tweak it so that they can have this immediate response that shows up in the news also, right? But the parties also frame the same things differently, like we saw in the cartoon newspapers. So here we have Republicans saying this is deficit spending, and we have Democrats saying, no, 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 this is economic stimulus, right? And so we're going to call these very different things. Language use is a really critical part of framing. So for example, you take a note, I'm going to read through these. So the government is debating which health program to adopt. Let's say there's mad cow or Ebola or something's going on. And 600 people are going to be involved. So I'm going to present you some options, and I'd like you to take note, which one would you choose? So before you move on to the next slide, write down which of these options would you choose. So in experiment 1, would you select A or B? So if you select program A, 200 of the 600 people will be saved. If you select program B, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. Right? This is of the 600 people who are involved. So take a minute and select A or B. Right? If you're good at math, do it in your head, but don't break out a calculator or anything. Right? Just go with your gut. And for number 2, I want you to select C or D. So if program C is adopted, 400 people will die of the 600. If program D is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So take a minute, think about it, and write down C or D. So again, right, I need to get a calculator. We're going with that gut. Okay. So what did people choose? This is an actual experiment. What did people choose? In experiment number 1, 72% of the subjects chose program A, 28% chose B. In experiment 2, 22 chose C, and 78 chose D. So we have almost a flipping of numbers, right? So we've got A and D and C and B. But what happened is that 72% chose A. C is the exact same, but it's said differently. Right? Only 28% chose B, but that's actually the exact same as D. So let's take a look at these again. Right? So A, 200 of the 600 will be saved. C, 400 people will die. Those are the same, right? And B and D, also the same. But because they're framed differently, particularly this says, they will die, is really going to turn people away from it. All right, so here were the final results of that experiment. So what did you choose for both of them? So framing determines the way that people understand and evaluate a problem. So I want to take a moment, do a quick reminder, and then we're going to stick with some examples of framing. How is framing different than Gerbner's cultivation effects? So remember that Gerbner's cultivation effects are long-term, heavy viewers, whereas framing is immediate, right? It says short-term, oh, here's how this article is written. That might shift, is very likely to shift how people think about a topic, right? So framing, effective in the short term, and framing is not limited to heavy viewers. You can read one article and it can affect how you think about something. So cultivation effect, long term, heavy viewers, small, average, but significant change. Framing, short term, anyone, and they didn't do the same quantitative numbers as Gerbner did for what is the significance. So, okay, back to framing. So let's see some examples, because it's really kind of the easiest way to kind of make this stick and to see the importance of it. So what I'm going to give you in the upcoming slides, I have 3 news stories. So I'm just giving you the news heading and the first few sentences of 3 different articles. They are about the same event, and they're about a person who's central to the event, and her name is Constance McMillan. And what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to switch slides and have you pause it, read the article excerpt, and in your notes, make note for each of the 3 examples. What do they choose to include or not? What do they focus on and elaborate on? And specifically, what language are they using to describe people and events? So I want you to be able to explain specific strategies that show up in each article. So you should actually be able to say, okay, this language happened in example 2 compared to this language in example 1 and 3, right? I have tried to leave out references to the sources just to prevent initial bias. I'll tell you at the end where they all come from. All right, so 3 slides, 3 articles, and for each of them, take some time and in your notes, make note of how is the story framed, what's included, what's not, what's focused on, and how is language used. Example number 1. Example number 2. And example number 3. Okay, so hopefully you paused and took some time to read each of those 3. And so what distinctions did you see between them? Take a minute, clean up your notes, right? Pause it if you need to, because it's important to try and figure out what you're seeing going on. So, quick overview of some of the things that I noticed, and this is by no means everything that's going on. So in example 1, we see that Constance's name is used immediately. It's used consistently throughout. They say that she successfully sued her school for the right to attend. Right? She was directed to a fake prom. She was directed along with others, including 2 with learning disabilities. And so this article we see a lot of kind of getting sympathy from the audience about, they took all the misfits, all the kids who should be accepted in the school but aren't, right? Those learning disabilities, Constance and her girlfriend, and those are the ones who've been sent off to a fake prom, and really they were just fighting for their rights, right? And we very much get this is Constance, this is who she is, and this is a person. In comparison, in example 2, she doesn't have a name until the second sentence. Before that, she's referred to as the lesbian teen, right? Which this minimizes the human element. And so it's very much this objectification that says, oh, this big, scary enemy lesbian teen, as opposed to it's an 18-year-old girl named Constance, right? But this lesbian teen, big and scary, she forced the school, she sues the school, right? And so she's doing these very negative, violent things to the school. And some really interesting other language is this concept of prom drama. So when we think of drama, you think of the shoes don't match the dress, the corsage didn't show up in time, the limo was late, right? You ended up in the same tux as someone else, right? So drama it's shallow, right? It's not important. And so by calling this prom drama, they are writing it off, right? They're saying this isn't a big deal. This is someone causing a brouhaha that they didn't need to. They focus on how this has caused unhappy classmates, that this has ruined other people's senior years. And so we have a very different language use going on from the first example. All right, in the first example, we have she's suing for her rights. In the second example, she's forcing the school and ruining people's years. And for this shallow drama, not important thing. And then example 3, we, in the title, immediately see Constance's name connected to the word activist, right? But we also see her called like any other high school senior, so she's a normal person. She's just like anyone. And we see that she has set an example for the world. So again, back to that activist, like this person has done this big thing. So these are 3 very different ways to talk about and to understand and affect the audience's thinking about the same situation. So in case you're interested, the first example came from the Huffington Post, example number 2 came from Fox News, and example number 3 came from Glamour magazine. And unfortunately, I don't know how to make links active within the video, but they're typable if you do want to go and see the full stories. Or just Google Constance McMillan and you'll find it. So as we think about being a critical consumer of media, it's important to think about why is the framing of a story important? And it's important because it affects how we interpret the world, its problems, and the causes and solutions to those problems. For instance, I have some examples for you. When we talk about advice to prevent sexual assaults, we often hear things like, go with friends to social gatherings, don't walk home alone at night, don't wear provocative clothing, never leave your drink unattended, be wary of strangers, don't get in cars with strangers, on and on and on and on and on, right? And I have another website there for you if you'd like to see more of the information. There's quite a few you can get this from, but there's one in particular. Okay, so this is normally how advice to prevent sexual assault is presented. For example, even from this website, which is a sexual assault prevention site, so it's geared towards victims. But what if we reframe how we talk about preventing sexual assaults? So this woman has a sign that says things that cause rape: flirting, the outfit I'm wearing, drinking too much, or rapists. Right? That's a very different way to think about the cause of sexual assault. And one of my favorite lists of prevention tips for sexual assault: number 1, don't put drugs in people's drinks in order to control their behavior. Number 2, when you see someone walking by themselves, leave them alone. Number 3, if you pull over to help someone with car problems, remember not to assault them. Number 4, never open an unlocked door or window uninvited. Number 5, if you're in an elevator and someone else gets in, don't assault them. Number 6, use the buddy system. If you're not able to stop yourself from assaulting people, ask a friend to stay with you while you're in public. Number 7, always be honest with people. Don't pretend to be a caring friend in order to gain the trust of someone you want to assault. Consider telling them you plan to assault them. If you don't communicate your intentions, the other person may take that as a sign that you do not plan to rape them. Number 8, don't forget, you can't have sex with someone unless they are awake. Number 9, carry a whistle. If you're worried you might assault someone accidentally, you can hand it to the person you're with so they can blow it if you do. And number 10, don't assault people. So the difference that we're seeing in the framing here is, instead of saying, right, victims, this is on you, right? You have to go with other friends. You should not be at home, like walking home alone at night. You should not be wearing provocative, revealing clothing. You should not leave your drink unattended in case it gets drugged. You have to be wary of strangers, compared to these ones that say, no, we need to put the focus on the people who are doing the assaulting, right? We shouldn't have to live our lives trying to avoid being assaulted, right? Instead, the focus needs to be on not having a culture that puts the responsibility on the victims of the assault as opposed to the people doing the assault, right? So instead of saying you were flirting, you were wearing something provocative, you were drinking too much, right? Acknowledging that these are not the causes of rape, that the causes of rape, the causes of sexual assault are the assaulters, right? And that's a very, very different way to think about and talk about this topic through framing. So it's important to become a critical consumer. You ask critical questions. Why is this story getting so much attention? Whose interests are being served by the story? Are the sources of evidence credible, reliable, sufficient? Are the stories balanced? Do we hear all the sides of the issue? And are the gatekeepers keeping certain perspectives from us? And what might their motivation be? So overall, we're inundated by mass media. Their messages have profound influence on our lives, our relationships, and society. So critically assess the messages you're receiving and how they're crafted to be a critical consumer and thinker.